Returning to our other top stories, though, Germany's cabinet has approved a major strategy for dealing with China, its biggest trading partner, but also a potential geopolitical rival. After months of delay and debate, this is the German government's first strategy paper on China. It's expected to put pressure on German companies to de-risk or reduce their dependence on Beijing without cutting off cooperation. Recent supply chain interruptions and potential problems with China's ambitions over Taiwan have caused concern among leaders here. Our China analyst, Clifford Coonan, is here to take us through the paper. This new policy builds on this idea that China is a partner, competitor and systemic rival. What sort of tone can we then expect from this advice, this strategy paper for both companies and for politicians?
Well, I think what we're hearing is, I think it's an effort to say an awful lot of things at once. I think we've seen these words that you mentioned about competitor, partner. These seem to me not very good, a very good basis for a relationship in many ways. I mean, you've got a systemic rival who you're also trying to be a partner with, who you're trying to compete with. In some ways, it's like trying to keep a lot of plates in the air at one time. We've had talk about decoupling, which is the idea of separating both Europe from the West from China. That's largely been dismissed now in favour of the new buzzword, which is de-risking, which is managing the risk. As far as the Chinese are concerned, decoupling and de-risking are the same thing, and they've rejected both of them. So there's a lot of rhetorical games at play here, and this new document aims to provide a framework to maintain good relations and to take into account, say, the interests of German companies in China, while at the same time making it clear that Germany wants to reduce its risks there. So there's a lot of different things happening at once. And I think what we're seeing with the fact that it's been published at all, given the divisions that were going in within the coalition ahead of this, is significant. But the fact that it exists at all is an important development.
Also happening soon is Annalena Baerbock's speech to the press. She'll be fronting the press about this strategy, and we'll be following that live for you. We're looking at those live pictures now with the press conference setting up. Tell us more about de-risking of German companies, because how does this go hand in hand with top Chinese delegates at the same time signing off on a number of contracts with Germany's business leaders recently, and this push for more business and yet less business, but cooperation and not getting too intertwined and dependent on such a huge country and huge economy.
Yeah. I think. Well, this is it. As you've just said, you know, it's so complicated. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, China just shut down, and suddenly there was nothing, and that was obviously there was a problem. Then you have the issues like the Xinjiang province, where you have oppression of the Uyghur minority there, for example. That's been problematic for, say, German companies which operate there. So you have these sort of these are problematic for the companies working there. But at the same time, there's a feeling that Germany needs China. It's nearly 300 billion euros of trade every year. It's by far Germany's biggest trading partner.
But what then are the biggest risks for German companies? You mentioned the pandemic, of course. So what, China suddenly shutting down again, or China changing its position on things, or companies worried about their reputation because they're using slave labour, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are two major concerns. Another obvious development since a lot of this debate started was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That changed everything, because China has ambitions in Taiwan, and where Taiwan, which is generally seen as a Western ally, were China to invade that, we would have a kind of a similar situation that we had with Russia, whereas they had to pull out the German companies out of Russia, and if the same pressure suddenly happened over Taiwan, that would be a major problem for German companies.
How binding is this strategy going to be, though, for companies?
I think it'll have authority in that it's going to have things like stress tests. People are going to have to assess risk. The government has said that it won't bail out companies if, for example, Taiwan is invaded. Whereas in Russia, you had Germany bailing out its companies there. They've said in this case they're not, that companies have to do risk assessment, and that they hope not to be put into a position where they have to bail them out. Now, that, of course, doesn't necessarily rule out a bailout, but it's certainly in terms of, and you can see the kind of rhetorical games that are going on here, but it does show that there is an intent to try and reduce the stress and to reduce the threat.
And you brought up the Ukraine war. How is that going to work? Are we going to see more pressure from Germany put on officials in Beijing to make a clear stance on what's going on in Europe?
Well, I think the European position is becoming a bit clearer now. I think China for a long time has been keen to keep Germany and France together. They always, whenever they think about Europe, they think about Germany, France, and the UK. Obviously, the UK is now a separate entity, and so the focus has been very much on Germany and France. And so I think a lot of the language in this report is the same language as we're seeing coming out of the EU. So I think we're going to see this focus on de-risking again, which is part of the EU policy. How it actually plays out on the ground is still difficult to work out. I mean, they are rebuilding relations since the pandemic. They've been slow to rebuild. We had Li Qiang, who's the premier, visiting Germany recently, in which he was saying, we're not going to de-risk our relationship with you, so why would you do it with us? So we're seeing relations build up between the two, and I think how this unrolls, we'll see over the next coming weeks. I don't think the Chinese government is going to like this necessarily because of these words like de-risking and strategic rival, but at the same time, they're also masters of political rhetoric. So I think in many ways they're actually going to be quite happy with it.
I'm sure they won't be happy if the word Taiwan is mentioned. How much detail will it go into as far as China's ambitions in Taiwan go?
Well, looked at from a European perspective, Taiwan has become incredibly complicated since Macron went there and basically kind of intimated that Europe wouldn't get involved if China were to intervene in Taiwan in some way. And they've since rolled that back a bit, but there's a general feeling that there isn't really a unified stance in Europe on Taiwan, that maybe it wouldn't be quite the same stake as it is as Ukraine was, you know, that it's obviously it's a lot further away. That's going to be a big factor. You can never underestimate that. But I think the lack of clarity maybe about Taiwan, within obviously you have people like Annalena Baerbock who's been much more forceful in backing it.
She said that it would be a horror scenario for the world if China invaded Taiwan because half of global trade goes through the Taiwan Strait. Yeah. And we know what happened during the pandemic. The semiconductor industry alarm bells were ringing, weren't they?
That's right. And she also said that the point of this policy was to show that Germany was no longer naive when it came to these things. And the fact that she isolates that Taiwan Strait is more than just about Chinese nationalism. It's actually about the fact that this is an incredibly busy trade area in the world that needs to be, that the West has an interest in keeping open. There's a lot of realpolitik reasons for backing Taiwan in this situation.
We'll have to leave it there, but Clifford, we'll come back to you once we go to that press conference with the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, and we'll have to leave that report there and go back over to Annalena Baerbock, the German Foreign Minister.
Colleagues from the German Bundestag, 800 million people. This is the number of Chinese people who, in the last few decades, have found their way out of poverty. 298 billion euros. This is the sum of goods traded between Germany and China in the last year. It's a record sum. 87 gigawatts. This is the amount of solar power that Germany installed last year alone. More than the entire installed capacity of solar power in Germany. 96%. This is the percentage of China's gallium percentage. And since last week, China wants to limit its exports. 69 naval vessels. That has made China the largest naval power in the world. 100 million Hong Kong dollars. That is the wanted money on 8 pro-democratic activists that live abroad. Now, all of these are highlights of a country that is so complex as the 1.4 billion people who live there. A country which in the last 10 years has changed so dramatically as perhaps no other country on this planet. A country whose development is going to define this century. And that is why it is so important that our society engages with this reality. For Germany, China remains a partner, a competitor, a systemic rival. But the aspect of the systemic rival is one that has been in the forefront increasingly with each recent year. So we don't need a magnifying glass to see that China has changed. And if you listen to what is being said by China, you know how assertive and self-confidently China is shaping our world. More repressive inwardly, more assertive in the outside world. China has changed, and as a result, our policy on China must change with it. And that is the objective we are pursuing with this first China policy of the German government that we approved just a few minutes ago in the cabinet. It is the result of countless interviews and discussions that we've had in recent months, naturally in the portfolio with our colleagues of the German Bundestag, with representatives of German trade and industry, with scientists in all of its diversity, with NGOs, and above and beyond, with our international partners across the globe. And naturally, we have also spoken at length with our Chinese partners, particularly since that's been possible in person in Beijing, in Berlin, but also at many international meetings. And this process took its time, and I'm grateful that you referred to the number of weeks when you were introducing me, not the number of days, but it took that time, and we needed that time, because our relationship to China is far more than the contact between individual ministries, between the contact between a foreign minister and their counterpart, or the President and the German Chancellor. The exchange and our relations between China and Germany and the European Union also include the employees of Baden-Württemberg automotive industry that gets lithium for its e-vehicles from China. It is also a company from North Rhine-Westphalia that has medications from China to combat deadly diseases. Our relations are also relations between the university, a university in Saxony that has a research project on artificial intelligence, which then has to go away and think about how we're going to deal with applications from China for the project. And all of these questions require a coherent response as a society. And this is why there are 3 aspects of our China strategy that are particularly important to me. Firstly, we are not decoupling from China. We merely want to de-risk. That is, minimize our risks. We experienced how painfully in one-sided dependence makes us last year. And in order not to repeat this mistake, as a German government and within the EU, we are pursuing de-risking as our #1 priority. And this includes that responsibilities for risky entrepreneurial activities and decisions must remain clear, and trusting in the power of the free market in good times, but that in crisis times, expecting the strong arm of the state. This is a 2-pronged approach that isn't going to work in the long term, and it cannot lead us to be one of the strongest economic powers that we are. Thus, we have to get away from this and pursue our national economic and social interests. And we need to focus on our economic security more. So that means that cluster risks that don't just impact on individuals, but rather impact on an entire national economy must be minimized. Thus, companies that make themselves particularly dependent on the Chinese market will increasingly have to bear the financial burden of this risk. And part of economic security is that companies need to ensure that in their supply chains they are aware of human rights and ensure that they are not being violated. Naturally, we have a responsibility to human rights in and of itself, but it's also about reducing the risk of Germany as a business location, and also Europe, because if we were to accept this kind of violations of human rights, this would also impact on us as German and economic and European countries. We also have to protect our environment against unfair competition by developing new tools and using them. For example, a tool against coercion, so that when necessary, we can protect our companies through third-party countries, if necessary, through restrictions on trade on a European level, so that they are not exposed to blackmail. We've seen in the case of Lithuania that this is not a theoretical debate. And we have also really felt what can happen if these vulnerabilities to blackmail are not addressed together, that this can impact on one EU member state and they can be exploited. In moments like these, joining forces as the EU is a real strength. The single market within the EU is the strongest tool at our disposal. It gives us leverage, but it is also a protective shield. Because, of course, the huge Chinese market cannot be ignored, and indeed we do not want to ignore it. But at the same time, it is equally true that the Chinese market needs the European market as well. Thus, the tension around Taiwan cannot leave us cold. A military escalation would also be a risk for millions of people across the globe, and that means here at home as well. Half of all container ships in the world go through the Taiwan Strait. And container ships, as we experienced all too painfully in recent weeks and months, have things on them like anti-fever syrups or machine components, food, essential drugs and medications. And these are all things that go through this artery of international trade, the Taiwan Strait. So for us, what that means is that we need to look at what's happening there. It also means that the more diverse our supply chains and trade routes are, the more resistant the European economic location will be. And Germany as an economic location will be. This brings me to my second point. In order to become more independent, we are investing in our global partnerships. Thus, for example, by entering into raw material partnerships in Africa, Latin America, and the Asian Pacific region. At the moment, the EU imports 98% of rare earths that we need for electric engines and generators from China. Now, logically, we cannot simply flip a switch and change where we get it from, but we can begin, indeed we have begun, to access new sources of this and to ensure that there's a more fair competition here, not just in Europe, but beyond. This is one of our perspectives when we want to make progress with new trade agreements. Hubertus Heil and I were in Brazil last month. This is a country that has imported or exported almost 6 times more goods to China than to Germany. And if we're talking about rare earths and rare raw materials, and looking at that particular region, what we find is that there are European and German companies, But there are very, very few indeed. So if we do not want to be left by the wayside in this competition, we need to have a strong agreement between the EU and the Mercosur states. And we want that. All of us want that. And what's good is that we don't have to be forced to do this, but rather it is in our mutual interest to pursue this aim. And in doing so, we can positively affect trade worldwide. Across the globe, we can set standards for fairness and sustainability in a new age and on an equal footing. The third point I'd like to make is that we want to diversify, but we also want to ensure that we expand our cooperation with China because we need China. This is true in terms of our economic contacts and ties, because we do not want to put obstacles in the way of our development or China's development economically. This is also true if we bear in mind the biggest challenge facing us, namely containing climate change. China emits about a third of the world's carbon emissions and is continuing to build fossil-fueled power plants. But China hasn't just seen the opportunities offered by climate change, but is also implementing them at a pace that is simply breathtaking and actually produces more renewable energy than the rest of the world together. When it comes to the government consultations we held in May, as a result, we didn't just express our willingness, but also our common aspiration to work together, more closely together in the area of climate. This is a potential we want to harness not just as Europeans together with China, but particularly with our partners across the globe, our friends in the US, but many other partners as well worldwide, because all of us need this green transformation. One thing is clear, without China, we are not going to manage to contain the climate crisis, nor to achieve more fair prosperity across the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, all of this and much, much more besides are issues that we have devoted ourselves to in our China strategy. These are issues that we are now giving a political framework for. In doing so, we are engaging with the challenges emerging from China over the last 10 years, and we are also looking at tools and pathways as to how Germany, at the heart of Europe, can work together with China without impacting on our liberal democratic order, without impacting on our prosperity and our partnerships with other countries on this planet. We are showing how 1.4 billion people in all of their wonderful diversity, from Xinjiang to Jiangdong, can become 400, or can have a relationship to 450 million people in the EU, from Porto to Vilnius, and how we can have stronger ties with one another. And we are also showing at the same time that we are realistic, but that we are not naive. It's my firm conviction that these challenges are ones we will be able to grow positively from in this world by strengthening the EU single market, by having a good economic policy for Germany, and by ensuring that all parts of society, from a university in Saxony, an automotive manufacturer in Baden-Württemberg, and every ministry in this German government, which is why I very much look forward to entering into a dialogue with you. I'm grateful to my colleagues from the German lower house of parliament, the Bundestag, for being so flexible, just as our global policy requires it today. And I'm grateful to Mr. Merrickx particularly that we can be here today at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. So I want to thank you for the last, not 83 weeks, but the last 83 hours can be here. I'm grateful that we can be at the Merrickx Institute, one of the leading China Studies institutes in Europe, that we could present our strategy to you now. Thank you very much.
And that was the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock outlining Berlin's first ever strategy for dealing with Beijing amid rising geopolitical tensions. tensions. Baerbock just saying there that the German cabinet had just approved this paper. It wants to reduce its dependence on its biggest trading partner, but not at all costs. I've got Clifford Coonan here with us, our China analyst. Clifford, doing business with China used to be about profits. Has it now become about politics?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpick here in what we've just had. I mean, I spent 15 years in China, and one thing which always struck me was that there was never really any effort to sort of decide what kind of relationship we want with China. There was never any really big thinking about it. And there was also a sense that China understands the West in the way that the West doesn't understand China. And what we're seeing now, I think, with things like this paper is that finally there are efforts to put these things into context and actually address what are we talking about when we talk about China. And I think that's a key sort of overarching theme from this. And I think putting politics and business together is something, I think for many years we kind of got lost in the weeds when it came to dealing with China. And a lot of policy was dictated by big companies, European companies, particularly in Germany. Recent events have shown that there's a need to maybe de-risk as the word that was consistently mentioned there. So I think, yes, I think this is an effort now to basically come up with a coherent policy that looks at all aspects of this thing, that you have to have a holistic approach to China. You can't just cherry pick because, as we've seen, it doesn't work.
So what you're saying is that this has been long needed and is necessary and is vital in moving forward for businesses and for Germany as a business location?
I think so. I mean, I think companies need certainty. They need transparency. There have been calls for years for China to have level playing fields when it comes to dealing with European companies, for example. And while there have been some reforms, there's a lot of promises, but they haven't followed through. And I think things like the pandemic have shown just how exposed European companies have been. There's a big issue which we haven't actually seen mentioned that much, but it's a very important one, is technology transfer. A lot of German companies, for example, the car companies, for example, have major dealings in China, which have seen a lot of European technology move to Chinese entities. And now you're seeing things like the Chinese electronic car industry is booming, using largely technology that was developed in the West at the expense of the German car makers. Volkswagen is slipping down the ranks, for example, there. So there's a lot of areas where I felt one thing which really struck from what the foreign minister was saying was that there's a bit more of a realization that there needs to be a clear-eyed approach to this rather than trying to cherry pick and move around, and a holistic approach.
I find it interesting that China's criticized Germany for involving politics in trade and business, and yet at the same time, China demands, in some cases, that a member of the Communist Party be on the board of foreign companies. I mean, the demands that are made are quite extraordinary in comparison to the reality on the ground.
Yeah, I sometimes think, I mean, the Chinese government is very, very good at negotiation, and it's very good at saying, at using, it doesn't bother so much with political rhetoric, it just kind of comes out on the attack. And whereas in Europe, we're much more used to consensus and trying to find a way through. And basically we are a victim of what are our own, we consider to be our strengths, transparency, openness. It leaves us exposed when we come up against, the Communist Party in China, which is very much focused on achieving its aims.
But how do you think this will go ahead, considering what Germany wants here? It wants to continue its close relationship with China, but it wants businesses to start pulling back and de-risking, not decoupling. But what we're looking at here is a toxic relationship.
It is. I mean, I think what you're seeing is what she mentioned, is what Annalena Baerbock mentioned, was a change in the nature of the relationship. One very important point she made was that China needs Europe. And I think that's kind of gotten lost in a lot of this. I mean, we had data today which showed that Chinese exports They were very, very bad last month. They're worse since the start of the pandemic. The Chinese economy is flagging. It's heavily indebted. The real estate sector is in trouble. China needs Europe. It needs European investment. It needs European ideas. It needs Europe's markets. And I think there's a final realization that maybe Europe has more leverage than it thinks. And that's a very important psychological change in this toxic relationship.
So do you think this paper could bring more balance to this trade relationship?
Well, I think what it does is it sends a clear signal. So, for example, you've had things like with the lender, the powerful regions in Germany, for example, have made unilateral decisions or bilateral decisions with China, such as selling a stake in the Hamburg port, for example, to the Chinese state shipping company COSCO. Now, and then there was a question about whether that broke federal rules. Now you have basically the Bund, the federal German government, saying these are the rules, these are the terms of engagement on which we deal with China, and I think it'll bring clarity to this relationship, and that's an extremely important development.
Clarity, but do you think it will improve the relationship?
I think I've always felt that Europe needed to push back more against China. So I think it can only improve it.
Clifford Coonan, thank you very much for coming in and for following that speech by the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and Berlin's first ever strategy for dealing with Beijing.